At the end of Godzilla, we see a new and interesting look at the monster. Here he lies on the ocean floor, not destroying cities or firing at the military. No, he is resting, away from all that, in his home on the ocean floor. It is here where Dr. Serizawa unleashes the oxygen destroyer, putting an end to this monster forever. It's a change in rules from when Gojira first surfaced in Tokyo, wrecking the city. But why would he do that? Why was Japan subject to this horror? Why does the scars of World War II never heal for the country? Despite over 60 years since the franchise started, it still continues to persist, adapting to all types of forms but never forgetting where it came from. Despite this, who was the victim? Who was the perpetrator? And why is the past forgotten? I already did a video reviewing the original 1954 Gojira, breaking down what makes that movie persist to this day, why it is meaningful, and how it fairly portrays the arguments of its time that are unfortunately still arguments of our time. In the video, I brought up the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can't talk about the movie without mentioning these events. I don't believe I went deep enough into the story. I left it open-ended for interpretation, as at the time I didn't believe I was qualified to give those answers, and I imagine I still won't be able to by the end of this video. But it is worth talking about. Here are a few arguments that are often used to claim why the atomic bombing of Japan was justified, or not as influential as you would think. 1. No military in the world would back down from such a low-risk, high-reward mission, only requiring a couple of planes and one bomb. Bombing the cities instead of brutal urban combat across the island for months was obviously going to be what Allied commanders would choose. Besides, if Japan had the technology, it is very likely they would have used it, and the fire bombings of Tokyo took more lives anyway. 2. Talk of these bombings is to remove or cover up what Japan did to the rest of the world, what their East Asia co-prosperity sphere brought to the people living there. It is merely a distraction from Japan's war responsibility. The atomic bombs have always been their out. 3. The bombings saved Japan. Potentially hundreds of thousands of lives were likely to be lost in invasion, so it got Japan to surrender, ending the war and preventing further loss of life, and getting the Soviet Union to back down a bit. Those are three big arguments for the atomic bombings, and they do have some merit. But let's look at three arguments against the bombings. 1. It was exceedingly cruel to kill that many people with that weapon. Most of the people killed were just civilians, after all. It's a war crime. 2. The bombs were less of a strategic move, but a political move, something to make the Soviet Union back off, after the Soviets began taking huge swaths of territory from Japan and China and Manchuria. The US wanted to show it had power. It wanted Japan for itself. 3. No matter what is said, it can't be argued against that the creation and the use of the nuclear bomb can never be justified. Was it worth it to save hundreds of thousands of lives just to put billions of lives at risk every day? Now that these weapons are here, we can never live without them. I bring up these arguments as they have some bearing on the Godzilla films. But the original Gojira seemed concerned on the principle that these events never happen again, a sentiment shared by many. An interesting note about Godzilla is that its original director, Ishiro Honda himself, was involved in the war. He was stationed in the China front for many years. I can't find much details, but he was stationed at a comfort woman camp, or to put it clearly, a place where women were forced to commit sexual acts by the Japanese Empire. Honda claimed that he was against this the whole time, but we only have his word for it. The war had changed Honda, and he became adamantly anti-war, as seen in his films. I mention this because I didn't mention all of this in my original review. At the time, I knew Honda had been in the war, but I did not know the extent. I would love to take his word for it on the situation, but as someone who just finds the Godzilla movies interesting, it's not my place to forgive Honda for anything he did during those years. Only the people there have the option to do that. I bring this up as Honda saw the pain inflicted on his country. He saw the cities reduced to rubble, and Gojira becomes a representation of that pain inflicted on Japan. While Godzilla's messages are universal, it is very clearly focused on what happened to Japan. I feel that it is important that there are movies about the devastation brought to Japan from Japan's perspective. But what about the devastation Japan brought onto other nations? War destroys a person and a country. While I brought up the argument that the people of Japan supported the war, at the same time, many U.S. citizens have supported numerous imperial wars by the U.S., but we never say that they deserve to be bombed. Saying they deserved it is just justifying the event after it happened with Japan. The thing is, the situation in Japan leading to the war was more complicated than we are led to believe. During the Meiji Restoration, the military and civilian government were separated in order to prevent the military from having too much power in the government. Instead, it created a situation where the military was free from government, and over time the military used subversive acts, including many assassinations, to gain control of Japan. Then they subjugated the people to relentless propaganda. Any group of people is susceptible to this. So saying that these people deserved it seems morally corrupt, as the children of this time grew up to be indoctrinated by the military. What else do children have than what is told to them? At the end of it, there's just no just way to kill a person. There isn't. What Godzilla has been trying to show for decades now is a want to reconcile, to show the consequences of humanity's violence, and to want to never happen again. Godzilla at its best is anti-war. Anti-war messaging can be difficult. A Godzilla film often praised for how well it spins the concept of Godzilla while keeping the core themes intact is the aptly named Godzilla, Mothra, Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, or GMK for short. What this film does is inject Godzilla with Japan's wartime guilt instead of Japan's wartime suffering. In this version, Godzilla is a great animal that has been possessed by the millions of souls who died because of Japan's war, American, Philippine, Chinese, and many others. Making it an interesting sequel by flipping the narrative, the movie is exploring not what other nations did to Japan, but what Japan did to other nations. This creature is angered that Japan has forgotten what it has done, angered that Japan actively denies and suppresses the past. This creature rises from the depths, intent on being non-caring in its destruction, destroying anything in its path. With a cold determination, it is one of the most brutal Godzilla movies of its time, showcasing survivors of one Godzilla incident being killed in another, harping back to the nuclear bomb. Even if one survives the blast, the radiation is still there. The film actively shows the youth being disrespectful to their elders and to the country, and are usually horrifically killed by Japan's very own guardian monsters. Monsters that the movie clarifies do not protect the people of Japan, but the country itself, the mountains and rivers. However, these guardians are preferable to Godzilla himself, an elderly man who, spoiler, actually died shortly after the 1954 attack, is intent on releasing these guardians to save Japan. All this sounds good, as the movie shows a certain complexity and a willingness to do what its predecessors had not. However, I argue that the movie fails at its anti-war messaging, if that is what it's going for. Perhaps saying it failed is wrong, as the movie never actually does seem to head that direction, despite taking into account Japan's war responsibility and military mismanagement. In one scene, we learn that the Japanese self-defense forces have lied to themselves and the public about how the original Gojira died. The self-defense forces claimed it was their own doing, while in reality it was Dr. Serizawa, using a weapon that he took to the grave with him. The character who hears this, a military commander who has been using this lie to encourage his men, doesn't seem all too affected by this. The military line is portrayed more neutral than taking any side of whether it was moral or immoral. The military commander gets back to work, putting a little more trust into the guardian monsters. But there is not much consequence to this bombshell, and the same with Godzilla's possession. To take away sympathy from the monster, Godzilla's eyes were made white, no pupils. This detracts, in my opinion, from the movie, as I think it could have worked, but it ultimately doesn't. We need to understand Godzilla. That is the point of the story, is to understand what happened and understand the people who did it. And that doesn't mean condoning or celebrating their actions. So with Godzilla, the creature lacks emotion, despite this being one of the most emotional interpretations of the creature. An angry and sad being desperate to take vengeance. We see Godzilla destroy huge swaths of the Japanese military, but it doesn't feel too much different than the previous times this has happened. Here, there should be something more to Godzilla's actions. The Japanese military caused so much harm, it took away their dignity and their life. Godzilla's destruction needs to carry more emotional weight as a monster that is the literal embodiment of the world's, and especially East Asia's, lingering hatred of Japan. Unjust, but perhaps understandable. And the main issue this movie has is Godzilla's defeat. Godzilla's power is so much that it defeats all three of the Guardian's monsters, but ultimately he is killed by an advanced explosive fired by a military commander into Godzilla's neck. This doesn't sit right with me, at least, because it still supports militarism and protecting Japan. What message I can gather is one, that may be truthful in a few aspects, but still problematic, is that Japan's military is different than it was in the past, and it will courageously defend Japan. But that is not how the problem this movie lays out can be solved. Japan still deals with hatred from its neighbors, mainly Korea and China, over what happened in World War II, not just from the governments, but from the people, those who experienced it, and those who are descended from those who did. Is the answer to ending this hatred increased militarism? This is Japan finding pride in its military, more specifically, a resourceful military leader. I give the benefit of the doubt here. I don't think this movie was attempting to be nationalistic propaganda. At the end of the day, it seems the team behind it was still trying to make entertainment. And perhaps audiences wouldn't accept Godzilla finding peace after the self defense forces realized that using the military only makes the creature more angry and destructive than before, leading to the military commander deciding to not use his weapons and maybe coming face to face with the creature, eventually having Godzilla go back to the ocean, facing, well, no punishment for what it caused. This is where I beg the question, why does Japan get the honor to enact punishment onto this creature that was enacting its own punishment to Japan for what Japan had done? We have run into a cycle of hate. Unlike the movies, it can't be solved in one climactic battle that is super cool. Instead, this constant vengeance seeking will only be a detriment to both sides. The movie was very close to having the unique storyline of combining the dichotomy of humanity and Godzilla, both stuck trying to exact vengeance on the other, that only serves to justify the other side's reasoning to continue the conflict, where one side needs to be first to step down, hopefully the side with more power, if that is the situation, and then the other side can too. Before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig two graves. Stopping the violence is more important than the punishment. This film shouldn't take too much credit for merely mentioning something bad Japan did in the past. And if the film does that, it needs to handle it better, and in my opinion, I don't think it did a good job. Now we approach the next highly praised Godzilla movie that I have taken issue with as well, Shin Godzilla. Now, is it my place to criticize the work from another country for being nationalistic? I myself have biases, and oftentimes other cultures' biases influence how they see work from another culture. For example, there was a Godzilla movie that depicted a flashback where a Japanese military commander and his troops are saved from a group of American troops in World War II by Godzilla, who kills the American troops. Some critics outside Japan saw this as heavily nationalistic, showing American troops being killed in such a fashion, especially in a war that Japan lost. And there's maybe a little merit there, but these critics may have just been a little too patriotic in the US, that if US troops aren't being depicted as liberators of the world, then the US is being undermined. I personally see this scene showing a moral gray in war, especially since Godzilla's goal wasn't to save the Japanese troops, it was to save itself, which happened to be of help to the Japanese troops. This culminates back in the present for this movie, where the military commander once again comes face to face with Godzilla, where there perhaps seems to be some recollection in Godzilla's mind before Godzilla properly kills the man. So I think the movie was attempting more than just watching Americans get killed fun. So when I review Shin Godzilla and content from other nations, I try not to focus on the betrayal of other countries, though sometimes I do, but to try and focus too on how the country presents itself in the film as well, and see how it may align with the common symptoms of nationalism before I issue a verdict. Now, what are the signs of nationalism? 1. A glorification of the country's past. 2. Usually an idea that the country is currently under crisis and must find itself again. 3. The development of the country to the detriment of other countries. 4. Increased hatred and violence against immigrants and those outside of the group. 5. This one appears a lot. The praise and hope of the country is given to one man, or a group of men, entrusted to steer the country forward for the people. And 6. Increased militarism and an idea of honor and dying for one's country. These previous mentioned things appear a lot, usually with a basis of justification for the greater good, and sometimes sprout from genuine concern. That is where we enter into Shin Godzilla, a movie that does fit some of the criteria on this list, partially or fully. Where does it go wrong for the movie? First off, making it from the view of the government. While creative, it leads into difficult territory to navigate as a writer. One thing I love about this movie is the incredible pacing. It is so good, it brings you in immediately and keeps up the whole film, never leaving you feeling bored. So, obviously, the team behind this movie were not bad filmmakers, but some of their choices can be interpreted as problematic. Here is the problem with Shin Godzilla. When told through the perspective of the government, it is portrayed as heartless, but at the same time filled with reverence for the leading politicians. The film's main goal is to make a modern Godzilla, reinterpreting the character once again for the modern times. Godzilla is now the accumulation of fear in the Japanese people, the government's mismanagement and unpreparedness for the Fukushima disaster. Already the messaging falls flat since in this movie this is Godzilla's first appearance. What government would be prepared for that? A closer approach to this message would be using Godzilla 2000's depiction of the monster, a creature that is known and rises to the surface then and again, causing destruction. To be fair, the movie establishes a character that is presumably dead by the film's opening, a scientist that identified that there could be a problem concerning mutated fish in the future. However, his findings were covered up in silence, not by Japan's government, but by the United States, when the Fukushima disaster was due to the fault of the company and the Japanese government not taking proper steps to prepare for such an incident, and the earthquake and tsunami that killed more than 19,000 people. The problem is, the movie doesn't focus on the people, those who suffer from the mishandling of those in power. So, while making a movie about a realistic response to Godzilla from the government's perspective is new and interesting, it is difficult to balance that with a message about how the failure of governments puts so many lives in danger. When Godzilla unleashes destruction on Japan, what the audience sees is the destruction of things, buildings, and cars mostly, not people. In fact, the movie doesn't really show people past the youth taking pictures of Godzilla with their phones from afar, with seemingly little urgency in the situation, portrayed almost as if naive to dangerous situations. Then who is this film trying to shift blame to? The movie talks more about the economic consequences and the human casualties, and to an extent that makes sense from a government's perspective, that is going to be important, and in trying to depict this as more realistic than its predecessors, of course a giant fire-breathing lizard would crash the economy. But to the person who cares more about the survival of their family than the economy, they will not find any representation. In fact, the movie continually doubles down on this. The main character is portrayed as competent, the first to understand the issue was caused by a living creature. He quickly rises through the ranks and then gives a speech to his team of workers, all wearing masks obscuring their faces. That is very likely that many of them will die in their attempt to stop Godzilla, but it is the sacrifice they must make for their country. Now, I don't want to say this is trying to be nationalistic. It is a comedy, it's still a problematic story trope. But to have a government leader who is the strong and right man for the job stand in front of his own people and say such a thing is a little odd. So there's another issue. In the original Gojira, every death is a tragedy, a pain that goes all the way to the heart of everyone unlucky enough to survive the attack. Dr. Serizawa kills himself in the film, but not in an attempt to save Japan, but to save humanity. He watches Gojira die before he cuts his own line. His suicide was tragic and easily preventable, but he couldn't live with the knowledge of this terrible weapon. Meanwhile, in Shin Godzilla, dozens of faceless workers we have not seen before are wiped off the face of the earth, while administering possibly one of the worst ways to die, blood coagulant, to Shin Godzilla. And not much is made of their deaths, other than one or two lines about how we didn't do it alone. Another problem with this movie that I take issue with is that there's no sympathy for Godzilla. In this movie, he is in terrible and constant pain, and his fate is horrid. Yet, no one ever seems to think of Godzilla as a living thing, just a big problem. And while the original movie went into depth about like the pain that Godzilla was going through and how horrible that final ending was, that Godzilla and Serizawa had to die. This movie just doesn't take that step, and I don't like that a living thing would be portrayed in such a fashion. What is Japan and Shin Godzilla? Just an unfeeling group of politicians and numbers on a spreadsheet? There seems to be no emotion other than pride in this film. Godzilla's mere existence isn't treated as the tragedy it is, unlike in its 1954 counterpart. There is no sympathy to the creature in this film. Everyone is unfeeling, and it is disturbing. The plight of those misled and mismanaged by the government is never shown. Instead, the message of this film ends up being that Japan must make its own future outside US influence. A good message on the surface, but what type of future is this movie hoping for? Sometimes a film's messaging can be confusing. Perhaps the director only wanted to show how great it would be if the government was competent, but it undermines the messaging when deaths are just means to achieve the end and not explicit tragedies. Can this film really be called one of the greatest Godzilla films ever? Japan is not an island, metaphorically. It has strong connections to much of the world. And I would personally would love to see more Japanese films critical of the United States' ongoing military presence in their country. This film is complex because its main ideas and themes aren't necessarily bad on their own. Many have full merit to be debated and discussed, but the movie, in ignoring the human cost and focusing on Japan's government becoming great again, fails in its objective in a way that sadly seems to lend towards not so subtle nationalistic tendencies. I want to touch real quick on the newer American movies. In the 2019 Godzilla film, Dr. Serizawa revives Godzilla in order to save the world with a nuke. Now, the film was going for a message of making peace with your past. In Dr. Serizawa's case, his father was killed in the atomic bombings. But I don't think making peace with your past should include killing yourself with another bigger bomb. The scene is an interesting inversion of what we have already seen in the original movies. There, Serizawa killed himself after killing the monster, and now he kills himself to save the monster. That is interesting, but using a nuclear bomb is questionable. The point of Godzilla is that the nuclear bomb was one of humanity's greatest mistakes. It sets in motion things that cannot be stopped. So, to make the nuclear bomb the savior of humanity makes the bomb a defender of the status quo. The bomb changed the world in irreversible ways, and to portray it just as something that happens here to get the plot moving again goes against what these movies have been trying to tell us. These movies are told from the American perspective, not the Japanese, and it shows. The pain of the bomb wasn't felt in the US, so it ends up not being given the same weight as it does in Gojira. The original Gojira depicts the plight that Japan faced from the war, but it was a message to all humanity, a brilliant balance, critical of the hubris of man to create the bomb and justifiably critical of the United States' ongoing H-bomb testing. Then, is there a Godzilla sequel that does justice to the original while being able to present an anti-war message successfully? Yes, there is. Godzilla against Mechagojira and its sequel, Godzilla Tokyo SOS. Masaki Tezuka was able to brilliantly combine the many complexities that a Godzilla movie can have, and crafted a beautiful film deconstructing military versus Godzilla in a light I have not seen before or since. He did this with a limited budget, limited time, and in a movie that is under 90 minutes long. Pretty impressive. The film starts out with one of my favorite Godzilla openings. A typhoon is striking a coastal city, and while a weatherman reports, the figure of Godzilla rises from the water. In response, Japan sends its special forces, specially created to defend the country from giant monster threats. They use their weapons, which have been effective at stopping previous monsters, but upon use on Godzilla proved to be useless. In a swift motion, Godzilla unceremoniously causes the death of a group of soldiers. But the guilt of the soldier's death is put upon the conscience of the film's protagonist, Hirokane Yashiro. In this film, this is the first time Godzilla has reappeared in decades, not since his defeat in 1954 at the hands of Dr. Serizawa, seen best in an elderly couple's reaction to hearing Godzilla is back. In response, the government finds it necessary to create a new weapon that can defeat Godzilla. The creation of a weapon to defeat a threat is usually a glorification of weapons, a glorification of something intended to kill, which I find quite immoral and vile. But the twist the movie puts on this, and the movie's willingness to show how cruel this is, brings it all together. Mechagodzilla is created from the bones of the 1954 Godzilla, and scientists extracting the DNA from the bones essentially recreate the monster. As we find out later, it is a ghost, as all the memories that the original Godzilla possessed, a cruel use of its life to be put into the service of fighting its own kind against its will. What the film does perfectly is to not dehumanize any of its characters. What they do may be immoral, but one can understand why, especially with the threat of Godzilla. Though the only person in this film who really thinks about how inhumane the process of resurrecting the original Godzilla is, and that brings it to the attentions of others, is a young child named Sarah, without the preconceived notions of actions being committed for the greater good, which is drilled into the minds of adults, and with a special care for life that the adults seem to have forgotten. Sarah sees Mechagodzilla for what it really is, an animal in pain. The pacing is immaculate as we are introduced to many characters, each with a unique view on the situation and sharing a common goal. For its messaging, the film's main theme is that every life is worth something, a value Sarah is not willing to give up, despite Akane's efforts. I find it interesting and refreshing that the character who needs to learn this lesson isn't one that sees no value in the life of others, but sees no value in their life. This is a very character-focused Godzilla movie and is able to naturally keep the focus on the characters through all the giant monster action. The decision to bring back the 1954 Godzilla creates the unique situation of having perhaps the greatest enemy ever to fight Japan in this universe be made into a character working for Japan. But one crucial second, it all changes. After firing a barrage of missiles at Godzilla, Godzilla roars and Mechagodzilla awakens. Suddenly, all the memories of the oxygen destroyer and the pain that the original Godzilla faced comes back. It overrides human control, and Mechagodzilla begins a rampage on Tokyo. On top of it all, Mechagodzilla seems to know exactly what it is doing, with an emotional intelligence. Mechagodzilla continues this rampage until it runs out of power and shuts off in front of a setting sun. All it took was one roar of pain. After the incident, Sarah remarks that it was their fault. I used to wonder why Yuhara didn't feel more guilt about the incident, but it is just his character. To him, it is a fixable fault. And to be fair, it was unforeseeable until after it happened, and he wasn't the only one working on the project. But Yuhara doesn't feel any sorrow for bringing this animal back to life in a mechanical form, because it was something he had done before at a smaller scale. He saw it as a helping hand to keep species alive using human ingenuity, keeping the species alive in the first place because of human pollution killing them, one should add. While the new Godzilla is more animal-like as well, it obviously shows signs of intelligence. But never is it deeply implied that it has a sense of whatever it is doing. When he first surfaced in 1999, it could have been a one-off instance. In fact, he doesn't reappear again until Mechagodzilla becomes fully operational. Mechagodzilla's arrival only serves to bring Godzilla back, as perhaps Godzilla sees it as an enemy on its territory. This movie depicts the ever-advancing military as ultimately fruitless, as all it obtains is remaining in the same spot. The final battle depicts this well, as after hours of fighting, the ultimate weapon that was meant to end the fighting once and for all ends up only enacting a severe but not lethal wound on Godzilla. The movie consistently showed the power of the weapon and showed the reaction of characters who looked in awe as it completely disintegrated buildings. But Godzilla doesn't care about that. Though some characters see it as a victory, some see it as the truth. It is a victory, but Godzilla's victory. He enacted more damage onto Mechagodzilla than Mechagodzilla did to him. Mechagodzilla can now not be used by Japan for at least another year, while Godzilla continues to be around, an everlasting threat. By removing the victory from the hands of the humans, the movie is able to submit its message about the uselessness of war and violence, that so much could be sacrificed to gain nothing at all. It's just interesting, too, that the weapon made to defend Japan causes more destruction to the country than Godzilla. There seems to be something supernatural about this rivalry between humanity and Godzilla that transcends reason. The two have just come to despise one another. Neither can claim to have the moral high ground as who started it, the bombings, Godzilla's rampage, the creation of Mechagodzilla. The start point is unclear, and the movie lies in the beauty of a complex and swirling unknown that keeps you thinking. Godzilla doesn't see himself as evil, and neither do the humans see themselves as evil. What Godzilla against Mechagodzilla does is to show the intricacies of conflict, the difficulty of moving on, and the intrinsic value of life. Sarah carries the plant around with her wherever she goes, and despite Akane's efforts to get her to stop, as it reminds her of her own painful life, she eventually gives in and accepts that she should live, upon realizing that she isn't alone, still has much to offer. While Sarah eventually does stop carrying the plant around with her everywhere she goes, I doubt she gave up on it entirely. And Yuhara, he is just Yuhara, a caring father that isn't perfect at social cues, but who is. Now, I know this may be brought up. Both Shin Godzilla and GMK leave a tease that Godzilla may not actually be dead. However, it seems more to be a baiting for a potential sequel. GMK shows that Godzilla's heart still beats, maybe showing the heart of the problem goes unresolved, and is maybe trying to serve as dramatic irony. But the character's celebration to the fall of Godzilla isn't presented as ignorant, so I can't come to an exact conclusion. I find it more satisfying that the characters have to see exactly that nothing they did defeated Godzilla. It only served to push him out to sea for a little while. Now it is time to talk about the sequel, Godzilla Tokyo SOS, which brings all the themes of its predecessor full circle and completes the arc of Godzilla and Mechagodzilla. This movie definitely goes even farther into the spiritual side of Godzilla, while still balancing it with the sci-fi aspect of Godzilla while keeping a light-hearted tone interspersed with serious scenes to bring the message home. In other words, Godzilla at his best. There is less focus on the characters this time, but Masaki keeps them enjoyable while simultaneously keeping up the good pacing from the last film. In this film, there's a new main character, Yoshito Chujo, the nephew of Shinichi Chujo, who was one of the main characters from the original Mothra movie that came out decades before this movie, which does have a few problems, but I'm not covering that here. However, the film does a good job of getting you up to date with everything, since most of us probably didn't take the time to watch every Toho Kaiju film beforehand. And it works since they already established Mothra in the continuity in Against Mechagodzilla. Mothra's fairies return to send the message that Mechagodzilla must be returned to the sea, and in return, Mothra will protect Japan from Godzilla. They argue that the resurrection of Godzilla was unnatural. Yoshito doesn't have as in-depth as an arc as Akane did. But this video is about nationalism or something I forgot, but he has appreciation and fascination with machines, including military weaponry, like jet planes, especially ones built and engineered in Japan. This is interesting, as an admiration for military planes built in one's home country is usually a sign of nationalism. It is quite common for the Zero plane to be praised as the rising of Japan's ingenuity, so to once again take a character that normally would be used to project the opposite message for this film is interesting. He likes military weapons, but he is going to learn that perhaps Mechagodzilla doesn't want to fight, but he likes machines a lot, so naturally to him, Mechagodzilla is the pinnacle of all of this, and he adores it. The film focuses on the repairing of Mechagodzilla, while Godzilla himself is healing from his wounds inflicted upon him from the last movie, and is on the prowl again. I find it interesting in this movie that the military decides to fight Godzilla where they fought last time, as the area is still in ruins from the previous film. Nice world building and continuity, but this may just be my bias from my worldview, but a good way to show how the destruction lasts, and that even after a victory there's still much to be done. In the films of the 80s and the early 90s, the Japanese government had been futuristic and cutting edge and moral, while after the last decade, Japan's government is portrayed as slower and more wasteful of its money, especially on big military projects, not crucial infrastructure like a city that was just destroyed. Mothra gets there first, and Godzilla and Mothra fight, eventually leading to Godzilla's victory. This is until Mechagodzilla shows up, and the two have a rematch. I have to say, for the limited budget and time, once again, the special effects are very well done. This movie has another one of my favorite openings of a Godzilla movie. Not to mention, Godzilla fights very intelligently. After being knocked to the ground, he uses his tail to trip Mechagodzilla before blasting his face with fire, blowing one of his eyes out. And this movie has a very good soundtrack. Anyway, we see that Mothra chooses to help Mechagodzilla in this situation, honoring their deal, but reluctantly since humanity has yet to honor its side. We see that the Prime Minister has become torn about the situation. He wants to let Mechagodzilla back into the ocean, but at the same time he is unwilling to give up what he sees as his best defense against Godzilla. So he decides to wait until the battle is over and then send Mechagodzilla back into the sea. However, no one seemed to have asked what Mechagodzilla wanted in this situation. Don't forget, they're still a sentient being being used against their will to fight, a fight it never wanted to. Yoshito eventually has to get inside Mechagodzilla to repair during the battle, and most interestingly, Mechagodzilla develops an appreciation for Yoshito for repairing him. As the battle continues, Godzilla and Mechagodzilla crash through the Diet building, a building that had managed to withstand all the previous attacks, but not this one, symbolically showing the end of such a long fight. Mechagodzilla then turns its hand into a drill and shoves it into Godzilla's chest, and just before the killing blow, Godzilla roars in pain again. And as before, all the memories come back to Mechagodzilla. It is legitimately painful to watch, despite all the new measures and reworking of Mechagodzilla to prevent it from ever breaking free again. It does, and it refuses to kill Godzilla. Yoshito experiences it all too and realizes how wrong the creation of Mechagodzilla is, and begs for the forgiveness of Mechagodzilla and apologizes for humanity's actions. Mechagodzilla then picks up Godzilla and flies out with Godzilla to the ocean, but it saves Yoshito's life while at it, displaying across one of its screens, Sayonara Yoshito. Now, okay, this creature has been connected to the internet for years, so of course it can read and write. Mechagodzilla this time instead chooses not to rampage like it did last time and get captured again. It chooses to stop fighting and go its separate way. Underneath all the modifications in the hard outer shell of this soldier, there was still a soul underneath. Anyway, that's where the film leaves us. Mothra is gone, but her children will continue to live on, and Godzilla and the ghost of Gojira are back in the ocean, finally away from the fighting of humanity. The film says that life must be lived within the boundaries that nature allows. That is an open-ended message. Because surgeries aren't natural, but no one is going to refuse a life-saving one on the basis of that. But then again, the universe will not last forever, and nobody will be able to stand forever. And the use of the dead to continue wars, perhaps more ideologically than in real life, is immoral. So that is why I see this set of Godzilla movies as perhaps being among the best Godzilla sequels and one of the most important Godzilla films, whose messages should be heard, and those messages land because the story wasn't thrown aside to make a more traditional or happy ending. Now, apparently, Against Mechagodzilla was meant to have a darker ending where Akane dies surrounded by a pool of Godzilla's blood. This was changed, but I think the film still sticks the landing. Sarah is like the continuation of Yamane from the original Gojira movie. And I really can't think of a better through character than Yamane. Keeping sympathy for the animal and the horrible things done to it is key. It is simply what is right. Godzilla is ultimately the plea for pacifism, one that these two movies keep alive. Director Masaki has a more hopeful approach concerning humanity in making Godzilla films than his counterparts for Shin Godzilla and GMK, seen by how Masaki shows no fear to display scenes of humanity in between darker scenes. Scenes that don't serve plot or character but I say are nonetheless important for understanding his interpretation of Godzilla. Something as simple as a young kid giving candy to a soldier after a disaster and being saluted in return makes Godzilla against Mechagodzilla that, despite all, we are good and we want to do good. Now, I know some will say that it's ridiculous to feel sympathy for Godzilla because he caused so much destruction, and that, of course, using Mechagodzilla was justified in protecting the country. What the films and myself would argue was that it was all simply not right. It is complicated. The lack of a human antagonist makes that clear. Everyone wanted what was best, but it's hard to where one draws the line. In the end, it was the humans' fault for bringing these creatures back, and how did it turn out for them? What I think we understand now is that we can find Japan's war on the Pacific and China as bad, and that we can accept that the bombings of Japan were bad. Neither side should shy away from the horrors inflicted from their country or others. There's plenty of room to talk about both. It has been said that wars don't have winners. For the people who have to experience the fighting, that very well may be true. What is important now is to not continue that hatred, but to make sure this never happens again.